What if the conventional narrative you absorbed about the Second World War got the ending right, but completely missed the plot? The textbooks tell you it erupted when German forces crossed into Poland in September 1939. That's technically accurate on the surface, but it's like explaining the Titanic disaster solely by pointing to the iceberg. Yes, the iceberg was involved. But the real story, the one that explains why the ship was in those waters, traveling at that speed, with inadequate lifeboats, that story runs much deeper. The actual trigger for humanity's most catastrophic conflict wasn't territorial ambition or ideological fanaticism. It was something far more mechanical and far more profitable. A cascading debt crisis inherited directly from the First Global War, and the international banking institutions that absolutely needed to collect what was owed. Consider this angle for a moment. What if the financial engineers who profited immensely from the 1914-1918 bloodshed deliberately engineered the conditions that would place Hitler into power? What if the invasion of Eastern Europe wasn't primarily a military conquest, but rather an elaborate debt collection operation 2 decades in the making? What if the most destructive period in human history, the one that consumed 50 million lives and reshaped every continent, functioned, at its core, as the world's largest debt restructuring program, wrapped in nationalist rhetoric and camouflaged as historical destiny? The foundation for understanding this was poured not in 1939, not even in 1933, when Hitler assumed control. The foundation was laid in 1919 at Versailles, where victorious powers and American financial interests created a mechanism designed to extract wealth from Germany indefinitely, a mechanism so mathematically brutal that another massive war became inevitable. On June 28, 1919, German representatives gathered in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles to sign what they'd been forced to accept as the peace treaty. The diplomatic histories focus relentlessly on territorial losses. Gone were Alsace-Lorraine, the Polish corridor, German colonies across Africa and the Pacific. Military historians emphasize the restrictions. Germany could maintain no submarines, no military aircraft, no heavy artillery. No general staff could be trained. The nation that had been Europe's industrial powerhouse was being systematically dismantled. But those were theater. The real weapon, the instrument that would extract wealth from German society for generations, was buried in Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. With those words, Germany was legally declared responsible for initiating the war, and therefore liable for all damages incurred by the victorious powers. This wasn't punishment administered after a fair judgment. This was a framework constructed specifically to justify infinite financial extraction. The final bill came to 132 billion gold marks. To make that number tangible, that's approximately $400 billion in contemporary currency, an astronomical sum for an economy already devastated by military defeat, revolution, and territorial loss. The reparations demand wasn't simply punitive. It was designed as a permanent debt extraction mechanism, a financial instrument that would ensure Germany remained subordinate to international creditors indefinitely. But here's what remains absent from most historical accounts, even sophisticated ones. Germany was never expected to pay this sum from its own productive capacity. The system wasn't designed for Germany to become self-sufficient and gradually settle its obligations. It was engineered from the beginning as a perfectly circular debt arrangement, managed and controlled entirely by American financial institutions. The mechanics were simple, but brilliant from a creditor's perspective. Germany would borrow vast sums from American banks and investment houses. Using those borrowed funds, Germany would make reparations payments to Britain and France. Britain and France, having themselves borrowed heavily during the war, would take those reparations payments and use them to service their own massive debts to American creditors. American financial institutions were essentially lending Germany money that would circulate through European governments and return to American bank coffers with interest accumulated at every stage. It was a closed loop, one that generated profits for creditors regardless of whether the underlying debts were ever actually paid. The Dawes Plan of 1924 transformed this arrangement from informal practice into official policy. Named after Charles Dawes, an American banker and diplomat, the plan restructured German reparations obligations and provided the legal and financial framework for massive American loans to Germany, ostensibly to stabilize its economy and allow it to resume payments. J.P. Morgan and Company assembled a financial consortium that extended 800 million gold marks to Germany in the initial phase, with subsequent tranches following. But the genius of this arrangement, and it was genuinely elegant from a banking perspective, lay in the conditions attached to those loans. American financial advisors didn't simply hand over capital and disappear. They maintained permanent supervisory positions within German government institutions, overseeing spending decisions and tax collection policies. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, fell partially under foreign control. The railways that connected German cities and transported German goods pledged as collateral, industrial assets and factories collateralized. The customs revenues that governments depend on to fund basic operations seized before the German state could access them. Consider what this meant in concrete terms for ordinary German citizens. A nation that had recently endured a catastrophic military defeat found itself operating under what amounted to international financial receivership, answerable to the same banks that had financed its enemies during the war. Germans worked, they earned wages, they paid taxes, but a substantial portion of that tax revenue never reached Berlin. It was automatically transferred to American creditors before the German government could allocate it to education, infrastructure, welfare, or any domestic priority. This system wasn't unique to Germany, though Germany's experience was the most visible and consequential. The Ottoman Empire had been subjected to nearly identical arrangements beginning in 1875, but this time the machinery was being applied to an industrial giant in the heart of Europe, to a population of 65 million people living under constant financial surveillance and external control. The Young Plan of 1929 extended and reconfigured these arrangements yet again, reducing the stated total of reparations, but extending the payment schedule to 1988, meaning 59 additional years of payments stretching into the future. Children born in 1929 would spend their entire working lives, from their first job until retirement, transferring wealth to foreign creditors for a war that concluded before they drew their first breath. The Young Plan also introduced something new and ominous: the Bank for International Settlements. Established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930. Officially, its purpose was to manage and facilitate these international debt flows in an orderly manner. Practically, it became something far more significant: a central bank for central banks, an institution operating above national laws and beyond democratic accountability. German reparation payments would be processed through the BIS and distributed to creditor nations. The bank's board included representatives from the German Reichsbank, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and major European central banks, creating a private financial governance structure that answered to no electorate and operated in complete secrecy. Between 1924 and 1930, American investors extended approximately 27 billion marks in loans to Germany. During that same period, Germany paid out roughly 19 billion marks in reparations. The mathematics appear to favor Germany, borrowing more than paying. But that was precisely the point. The objective wasn't to eliminate the debt. The objective was establishing legal frameworks and institutional mechanisms for permanent financial control. As long as the loans continued flowing and the reparations payments continued departing, the system functioned. Everyone profited. American banks earned interest. Creditor nations received payments. German corporations could borrow cheaply and invest in expansion. The entire European financial system appeared stable. The fundamental weakness in this architecture was a single critical dependency. The system's survival required an uninterrupted flow of American capital into Germany. And in October 1929, that flow stopped. When the American stock market experienced its catastrophic collapse, evaporating trillions in wealth in a matter of weeks, the consequence rippled instantly across the Atlantic. American banks, facing their own existential crisis, abruptly ceased lending to foreign governments and corporations. The capital that had been flowing into Germany dried up almost overnight. Think through the mechanics of what happened next, because this is where the circular debt machine revealed its fatal vulnerability. The entire reparations system depended on Germany receiving fresh American loans specifically to make its payments. When those loans terminated, Germany possessed no alternative revenue source to sustain the payments. When Germany couldn't pay reparations to Britain and France, those nations simultaneously couldn't service their own war debts to America. The closed circuit broke. Everyone stood exposed. All the financial engineering, all the confidence in the system, all the assumptions about perpetual stability collapsed into economic catastrophe. For Germany, the consequences were swift and devastating. Unemployment, which had stabilized at 1.3 million in 1929, exploded to over 6 million by 1932. Industrial production contracted by roughly 50%. The banking system teetered on the precipice of complete systemic failure. The Weimar government, already deeply unpopular because of the humiliation associated with reparations and the restrictions imposed at Versailles, became inextricably linked in the public consciousness with economic disaster. Families lost savings accumulated across generations. Businesses that had survived the war couldn't survive the Depression. Hunger returned to European cities. But here's the element that never appears in standard economic histories, though it's absolutely crucial to understanding what happened next. While ordinary Germans were experiencing genuine deprivation and terror, American and British banks that held German debt faced their own crisis of potentially catastrophic proportions. These institutions had loaned billions to German industrial corporations, to German financial institutions, to the German government itself. If Germany experienced total economic collapse, those loans would default. The defaults would create massive losses for American and British banks that were already hemorrhaging capital from the 1929 crash. The banking system couldn't afford a German default. But the banks also faced a profound strategic dilemma. They needed Germany stable enough to continue making debt payments. Yet they couldn't allow Germany to become so economically powerful or politically stable that it might challenge the debt arrangements, renegotiate terms, or simply refuse to pay. Germany needed to remain weak enough to be controllable, but strong enough to generate revenue. This was the impossible balance that defined German policy between 1929 and 1933. Into this environment stepped Adolf Hitler. In 1930, the Nazi Party remained a marginal political movement, one of many extremist factions competing for attention in the chaos of Weimar politics. 3 years later, in January 1933, Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. How does a fringe extremist party capture control of a major industrial nation in just 36 months? The conventional explanation emphasizes Hitler's charismatic oratory, the deeply felt German resentment toward the Versailles settlement, and the desperation created by economic collapse, pushing ordinary people toward radical solutions. All of that contains truth. But the complete story requires examining the financial mechanisms that enabled Hitler's political rise, and, more importantly, identifying which financial interests benefited from his ascension. Starting in 1930 and accelerating dramatically through 1932 and 1933, German industrial corporations began providing substantial financial support to the Nazi Party. This wasn't random or scattered. It was systematic, coordinated funding from major industrial concerns. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate, Krupp, the steel and armaments manufacturer, Fritz Thyssen, the coal and steel magnate, and numerous other major corporations. The logical question becomes immediately apparent. Where were these German corporations obtaining the capital to fund political parties during the worst economic depression in modern history, when most German businesses were collapsing? The answer lies in understanding which financial channels remained open even as general lending to Germany dried up. American loans and investments continued flowing into specific sectors of the German economy even during the Depression's depths. More significantly, the Bank for International Settlements, created in 1930 ostensibly to manage reparations flows, became a conduit for continued American financial transfers to Germany, bypassing the scrutiny that would have attached to direct government-to-government lending. The BIS operated in a realm completely removed from normal banking oversight. Its transactions weren't subject to government examination. Its meetings occurred in absolute secrecy. Its board included representatives from central banks of nations that were officially at peace with one another, but increasingly hostile in their intentions. The bank could move enormous sums of capital in ways that remained completely invisible to the general public and even to most government officials. When Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, logic would suggest that American financial institutions would immediately cut off credit to a government headed by an openly hostile, ideologically extremist, and demonstrably unstable political figure. The historical record shows precisely the opposite occurred. American investment in Germany increased dramatically between 1933 and 1939. Why would major American financial institutions, operating ostensibly in their own self-interest, extend capital to the Nazi regime? The answer emerges from cold financial calculation, divorced entirely from moral consideration. Hitler promised to restore order, suppress labor unions and socialist movements, and most importantly, honor Germany's international debts. For American creditors, Hitler represented a superior option to the alternatives. A communist Germany would have repudiated the debts entirely, creating massive losses for American banks. A collapsed Germany unable to function would also default on obligations. But a Hitler government that promised stability, that would suppress internal dissent, that would prioritize debt service, that government was profitable. Hitler's regime became, from the perspective of international creditors, the instrument most likely to extract wealth from the German population and transfer it reliably to foreign banks. The scale of American corporate involvement with Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1939 becomes genuinely staggering when examined through primary source documentation. IBM, through its German subsidiary De Homag, provided the punch card technology that enabled the Nazi regime to conduct census operations and organizational systems. Technology that later proved essential to the systematic identification and tracking of Jewish populations during the Holocaust. IBM's president, Thomas Watson, received the Merit Cross of the German Eagle from Hitler in 1937 and maintained direct business relationships with the Nazi government throughout the 1930s without interruption or moral qualm. General Motors, through its German subsidiary Opel, became an integral component of Nazi military rearmament. By 1938, Opel was producing trucks for the Wehrmacht. Ford Motor Company's German operations similarly retooled production for military purposes. Standard Oil, controlled by the Rockefeller family, maintained extensive business relationships with IG Farben, the German chemical conglomerate. The two corporations entered into technology sharing agreements involving synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel production, technologies absolutely critical to Germany's capacity to wage modern industrial warfare, despite possessing minimal access to natural petroleum and rubber supplies. These weren't peripheral business relationships conducted at arm's length with plausible deniability. These were fundamental partnerships essential to German military capacity. Germany's industrial infrastructure had been severely damaged during World War I and further devastated by the Depression. The rapid rebuilding of German military capability between 1933 and 1939 required capital investment, technological transfer, and industrial equipment sourced substantially from American corporations and financial institutions. Without American capital, American technology, and American industrial cooperation, German rearmament would have proceeded at a fraction of the speed and scale that actually occurred. But the most explosive evidence emerges from examining the banking sector directly. Prescott Bush, who would later become a United States Senator and father of President George H.W. Bush and grandfather of President George W. Bush, served as a director and partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, a major investment bank with extensive financial relationships with German industrial companies. Specifically, Bush's firm maintained intimate financial connections with Fritz Thyssen, one of Hitler's earliest and most important financial backers. Union Banking Corporation, where Bush served as director, had its assets seized by the United States government in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act, precisely because of its documented connections to Nazi financiers and its facilitation of financial flows supporting the Nazi regime. These weren't incidental business dealings, conducted in ignorance of their implications. These were fundamental financial relationships that directly enabled the Nazi war machine. Chase Bank, which emerged from J.P. Morgan's commercial operations, maintained its Paris branch even after German occupation forces seized control of France. In that occupied branch, Chase bankers froze the accounts of Jewish depositors and liquidated their assets, directly collaborating with Nazi seizure of Jewish property and wealth. This cooperation wasn't extracted through coercion or threats. It was voluntary cooperation undertaken to maintain profitable banking relationships and preserve access to European financial markets, even as European Jewish populations were being systematically murdered. The actions were meticulously documented in bank records, yet after the war's conclusion, not a single executive faced prosecution or serious legal consequences. The Bank for International Settlements itself continued functioning throughout World War II, serving as a financial clearinghouse and processing center that included both Allied and Axis central banks within its operations. The BIS facilitated the conversion of Nazi gold, including gold seized from Holocaust victims' jewelry, teeth, and wedding rings, into currency that could be utilized in international financial transactions. The bank's American and British board members continued attending meetings in neutral Switzerland throughout the war, sitting across conference tables from their German and Italian counterparts, conducting financial business while the Holocaust proceeded. When these wartime activities were eventually exposed to public scrutiny, no one was prosecuted. No serious investigation was launched. The BIS proved too essential to the international financial architecture to be disrupted by questions about its wartime conduct or moral complicity in Holocaust financing. By 1939, when German forces invaded Poland and triggered the formal declaration of war, Germany was carrying substantial outstanding debts to American banks and corporations. Obligations that had accumulated throughout the 1930s as part of the rearmament program financed through American capital flows. Simultaneously, Germany held enormous debt claims against Eastern European nations that had borrowed heavily from German banks during the 1920s under the Dawes and Young Plan frameworks. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, and other nations in Germany's geographic sphere had accumulated significant German-denominated debts that remained outstanding and uncollected. The standard historical narrative presents Hitler's military aggression as driven entirely by ideological factors, racial theories, desires for racial purity, and the concept of Lebensraum, living space for Germans to expand and settle. That ideological component absolutely existed, Hitler's worldview was shaped by those racist theories. But the historical narrative misses an equally important dimension: the economic logic that made military expansion financially rational from the perspective of Germany's creditors and from Germany's own debt servicing requirements. If Germany conquered resource-rich territories in Eastern Europe, it could extract those resources and their economic value. It could seize the assets of conquered nations. It could impose occupation costs that required conquered populations to finance their own subjugation. It could collect on the pre-existing debts owed by those nations to German banks. Through territorial conquest and resource extraction, Germany could generate revenue streams sufficient to service its international debts to American banks. Conversely, if Germany remained economically weak and confined to its 1919 borders, it could never generate sufficient revenue to service those debts. Default would be inevitable. From the perspective of American creditors, military expansion was actually the solution that best served their financial interests. This explains something that otherwise appears inexplicable in the historical record. Why did American banks continue extending credit to Nazi Germany, even as Hitler's aggressive intentions became increasingly obvious? Why did American corporations continue supplying essential technology and equipment to the German military buildup throughout the 1930s, right up until American entry into the war? The answer isn't that American bankers and industrialists were ideologically sympathetic to fascism, though some certainly were. The answer is that creditors possessed a direct financial interest in Germany, becoming powerful enough to extract wealth from Eastern Europe. A weak Germany couldn't service its debts. A strong Germany, even a militaristic and horrifying Germany, could loot enough resources to maintain payments to creditors. The scale of plunder extracted from occupied territories was massive and directly connected to debt service obligations. When Germany occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, Belgium, and other nations, the German government imposed occupation costs, bills that required conquered nations to pay for the privilege of being occupied by the military force that had defeated them. France alone was forced to pay over 860 million marks annually in occupation costs, a sum that actually exceeded the direct military expenses required to maintain German occupation forces on French soil. The surplus didn't flow into improving conditions in occupied territories or into the pockets of German soldiers. It flowed directly to Berlin to service Germany's international debts and finance further military operations. This is the dimension of World War II that remains almost completely absent from popular historical consciousness. The war wasn't simply a military conflict and ideological struggle. It was a debt collection operation. The invasion, the occupation, the extraction of resources, the plunder of conquered nations. These were mechanisms for generating the revenue necessary to maintain payments on international financial obligations. Germany's conquest of Eastern Europe was, in financial terms, an attempt to create a revenue-generating empire large enough to service debts that the nation's pre-war territory could never support. But the financial transformation of World War II accelerated dramatically with American entry into the conflict in December 1941. When the United States joined the war against Nazi Germany, it fundamentally altered the debt dynamics of the entire conflict, and it did so in ways that exactly paralleled American involvement in World War I. Just as in the First Global War, American participation meant massive American lending to allied nations. Britain, which had entered the war in 1939 as a creditor nation with a global empire spanning multiple continents and generations of accumulated wealth, found itself by 1941 in desperate need of American military equipment, supplies, and financial support. The United States provided this through the Lend-Lease program, a mechanism that was officially presented to the American public as a generous loan program, but functioned in practice as a mechanism for converting allies into long-term debtors. By the war's conclusion, Lend-Lease aid totaled over $50 billion, equivalent to roughly $700 billion in contemporary currency. The British Empire, which had been the world's dominant financial power for 2 centuries, emerged from the war as the planet's largest debtor, owing the United States sums that would require decades to repay. The pattern that had emerged after World War I repeated itself with precise exactitude. A European conflict created emergency borrowing needs that allowed American financial institutions to establish completely dominant creditor positions over nations that had previously been economic rivals or even equals. Every artillery shell manufactured and fired, every tank produced and deployed, every bomber sent into the sky, every bullet manufactured, every uniform stitched, every meal provided to soldiers, every piece of medical equipment used in field hospitals. All of it represented loan obligations that would outlast the military conflict by generations. The longer the war lasted, the more Europe was forced to borrow from America. The more Europe borrowed, the more dominant America's financial position became. By 1944, with the war still raging across Europe and the Pacific, the financial architecture of the post-war world was being deliberately constructed, not by military strategists, but by financial engineers. In July 1944, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The stated public purpose was to establish a new international monetary system that would prevent future conflicts and create a framework for peaceful economic cooperation. The actual purpose was to formalize and institutionalize American financial dominance over the post-war world for generations to come. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. All other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. International trade would be conducted in dollars. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, D.C., would manage international loans and development aid, and both institutions would be controlled by American interests and American voting power. Think carefully about what this meant in practical terms for global economics. The United States emerged from World War II holding the majority of the world's gold reserves. Other nations had exhausted their gold supplies, purchasing American military equipment. America controlled the world's reserve currency. America served as the primary creditor for post-war reconstruction. Europe and Japan, both devastated by warfare, would need to borrow from American institutions to rebuild their infrastructure, factories, and cities. Those loans would be denominated in dollars, creating permanent demand for American currency. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency meant the United States could essentially print money to pay for imports, while every other nation had to earn dollars through exports and trade surpluses. American banks didn't need to win wars through conquest. They'd achieved through World War II what Britain had been forced to surrender through World War I: the ability to extract wealth from the global economy through control of the monetary system itself. The Marshall Plan, officially announced in 1947, extended $13 billion in economic aid to Western Europe for post-war reconstruction. This is typically presented in American textbooks as an expression of American generosity and humanitarian concern for European recovery. The financial reality was considerably more complex. The Marshall Plan was structured not as grants, but as loans, though the terms were relatively favorable compared to normal commercial lending. More significantly, European nations that accepted Marshall Plan aid were required to agree to specific conditions. They had to open their domestic markets to American goods, provide preferential treatment to American investors and American corporations operating within their borders, and align their foreign policies with American strategic interests. The aid came with strings that established American economic dominance over Western Europe for the subsequent 7 decades. The truly revealing aspect of post-war financial arrangements emerges when examining how Germany was treated after its defeat. Germany, the aggressor nation that had initiated the war, whose debts had directly contributed to the conditions making another massive conflict mathematically inevitable, was subjected to reparations far less onerous than those imposed at Versailles. Why would creditor nations, having just defeated Nazi Germany militarily, treat the defeated aggressor less harshly than they'd treated defeated Germany in 1919? Because American policymakers and financial institutions had learned a crucial lesson from the interwar period. Crushing a defeated nation with unpayable debts would create economic instability that threatened American investments and American financial dominance. West Germany received Marshall Plan aid. Its debts were restructured on manageable terms. The nation was rebuilt as an industrial power specifically integrated into the American-led economic system and NATO alliance structure. East Germany, under Soviet control, was systematically looted of machinery, technology, and resources. The Soviet occupation authorities extracted reparations in the form of productive capacity itself. East Germany remained economically devastated for decades, unable to recover. The contrast reveals the financial logic operating beneath the surface of Cold War politics. A debtor that can generate reliable payments indefinitely is more valuable than a debtor that collapses and defaults. The Bank for International Settlements, which had facilitated Nazi gold transactions throughout the war and processed gold seized from Holocaust victims, continued operating after 1945 with minimal interruption or investigation. No one associated with the bank was prosecuted for wartime activities. The institution was deemed too essential to the international financial system to be disrupted by questions about its wartime conduct or moral complicity. The BIS still exists today, still headquartered in Basel, Switzerland, still conducting meetings and financial transactions that occur beyond public oversight or democratic accountability. The final accounting of World War II debt took decades to resolve. Britain did not finish paying its Lend-Lease obligations to the United States until 2006, 61 years after the war's conclusion. Germany made its final reparations payment for World War I in 2010, 92 years after the armistice that ended the first conflict. But Germany's World War II debts were largely forgiven or substantially restructured, not because of moral considerations or humanitarian concern for the German population, but because creditors had learned that manageable debt was infinitely more profitable than unpayable debt. The Cold War that emerged in the years following World War II was presented to the global public as an ideological conflict between capitalism and communism, between democracy and totalitarianism, between freedom and oppression. This narrative appeared on news broadcasts, in textbooks, in political speeches. Students memorized it. Soldiers died for it. Trillions were spent defending it. But the financial reality operating beneath this ideological surface was fundamentally different. The Soviet Union represented an alternative economic system that rejected the debt-based financial architecture that American banks controlled. The entire Soviet bloc opted out of Bretton Woods. They refused to join the International Monetary Fund. They rejected the World Bank. They constructed an economic system that operated independently of dollar-denominated debt and American financial institutions. The Cold War arms race served precisely the same financial function as World War I and World War II. It created perpetual emergency borrowing situations that allowed financial institutions to establish long-term control over national economic policies and government budgets. The United States borrowed trillions of dollars throughout the Cold War to build nuclear weapons, to maintain military bases on every continent, to fund proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Central America, the Middle East, and Africa. The Soviet Union borrowed billions from Western banks to purchase technology and agricultural imports when Soviet agriculture failed to feed its population. These loans created debt dependencies that ultimately contributed substantially to the Soviet system's collapse. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, it wasn't conquered militarily by American forces. It went bankrupt. The Soviet economic system simply couldn't sustain the debt burden required to match American military spending while simultaneously trying to maintain living standards for 300 million citizens. The pattern that had been established in 1919 and perfected by 1945 continues operating virtually unchanged in the contemporary world. International conflicts create emergency borrowing situations that allow financial institutions to establish long-term control over national economic policies. The 2008 financial crisis, caused by reckless lending by major banks to borrowers they knew couldn't repay, resulted in those same banks receiving trillion-dollar bailouts funded by taxpayer debt. The banks that directly created the crisis became more powerful and more profitable after the crisis than they had been before. Executives faced no prosecutions. No systemic reforms were implemented. No accountability occurred. The specific institutions that profited from World War II still dominate global finance today. J.P. Morgan Chase, the direct institutional descendant of J.P. Morgan and Company that financed both world wars, is the largest bank in America. Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, all institutions with roots extending directly into wartime finance, control trillions in assets. The international monetary system still revolves around the dollar dominance established at Bretton Woods. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank still impose austerity policies on developing nations that prioritize debt repayment to creditors over human welfare, over healthcare, over education, over food security. When we examine current geopolitical tensions, particularly the escalating competition between the United States and China, the same patterns remain clearly visible. The U.S.-China competition isn't primarily about ideology or human rights, though those narratives are deployed in political rhetoric. It's fundamentally about which nation will control the international financial system and the mechanisms through which global capital flows. China holds over $1 trillion in United States government debt. The United States has used dollar dominance to impose financial sanctions on nations that refuse to align with American interests, sanctions that prove more effective and more devastating than military force. The next major conflict, whether it unfolds as economic warfare or escalates into military confrontation, will reshape global debt relationships precisely the same way World Wars I and II did. Emergency borrowing will accelerate. International financial dependencies will deepen. Creditor nations will establish control over debtor nations' economic policies and political decisions. The cycle will continue, refined by a century of experience in engineering profitable conflicts. So let's connect all the pieces together into a coherent narrative. World War I ended with Germany owing debts that were mathematically impossible to pay from legitimate economic activity. American banks restructured those debts in ways that gave them unprecedented control over German finances, over German government spending, over German economic policy. When the financial system collapsed in 1929, Hitler rose to power, partly through funding provided by German industrialists, who were themselves receiving American loans and accessing American capital through mechanisms like the Bank for International Settlements. American corporations, IBM, General Motors, Ford, Standard Oil, helped rebuild German military capacity between 1933 and 1939 while maintaining profitable business relationships with the Nazi regime. The Bank for International Settlements facilitated financial flows that included both Allied and Axis nations even during the war itself. World War II functioned as a massive debt collection mechanism where German conquest of Eastern Europe allowed extraction of resources sufficient to service international obligations, while Allied borrowing from American banks established permanent American financial dominance. The Bretton Woods system formalized American control over global finance by establishing the dollar as the world's reserve currency. The Marshall Plan indebted Western Europe to the United States, while simultaneously opening European markets to American economic penetration and corporate investment. And the pattern has repeated through the Cold War arms race, through the 2008 financial crisis, and through current geopolitical tensions. Prescott Bush, whose bank had financed Nazi industrialists, went on to become a United States senator. His son became president of the United States. His grandson became president of the United States. The banking and corporate executives who profited from Nazi Germany faced no prosecutions and no meaningful consequences for their actions. The institutions that facilitated Hitler's rise remain the dominant forces in global finance today. This wasn't failure or unfortunate coincidence. This was success. The system worked exactly as intended by those who designed it. Wars create debt. Debt creates control. Control creates profit. When you understand this pattern, modern geopolitical events make considerably more sense. Why do international conflicts consistently benefit the largest financial institutions while devastating ordinary populations? Why do emergency situations always result in increased government debt rather than decreased international tensions? Why do peace agreements always involve complex financial arrangements that seem to carry more weight and importance than territorial agreements or political settlements? Why are reparations and debt repayment terms often the most contentious elements of peace negotiations? The answer to all these questions is that wars aren't primarily fought over ideology, territory, or political disputes between ordinary people. They're fought to establish and maintain the debt-based financial system that benefits creditors regardless of which side wins the military conflict. Those Nazi banners hanging in newsreel footage, those soldiers marching into Poland, those bombs falling on London and Rotterdam and Coventry, they weren't just military operations conducted for territorial gain or ideological victory. They were debt collection activities. Every bullet fired, every city destroyed, every life lost represented interest payments flowing to banks that had created the financial conditions making war more profitable than peace. World War II didn't happen because Hitler was evil, though he certainly was. It happened because unpaid World War I debts had created a mathematical impossibility that could only be resolved through another massive conflict that would reset global debt relationships and establish new financial hierarchies. We're not living in a world shaped by the military outcomes of historical wars. We're not living in a world shaped by the ideological victories of political movements. We're living in a world shaped by the financial arrangements that funded those wars and those movements. More than any battlefield victory, more than any ideological triumph, more than any political settlement, that financial architecture explains why our current international system prioritizes debt service over human welfare, creditor rights over national sovereignty, and bank profits over democratic governance. The bankers triggered World War II. They collected their debts through 50 million deaths and were still paying interest on their victory.